Welcome back. Today, we're stepping into the Ottoman harem, into the story of a 12-year-old slave girl who was captured, sold, and carried into the most powerful palace on earth, and who went on to rule an empire for over 3 decades. This is the true story of Turhan Sultan, told in her own voice. Get comfortable, and let's begin.
Destur! Valide Turhan Sultan hazırdır.
I was 12 years old the day they took me from everything I knew. There was no warning, no goodbye. One moment I was a child in a village somewhere along the northern shore of the Black Sea. The exact place is lost now, swallowed by time and by the silence that empires impose on the people they conquer. The next moment, I was cargo, a prize, a gift wrapped in fear, riding south on a horse I did not choose, toward a city I had never seen, to become someone I did not yet know. They called it a raid. History books call it the Crimean slave trade. I simply called it the end of my old life. What they did not know, what no one could have known, least of all a frightened 12-year-old girl, was that this same catastrophe would carry me into the most powerful palace on earth. That I would one day sit behind a lattice screen and quietly decide who lived and who died, who commanded armies, who filled the treasury, and who lost their head. That for over 3 decades, the fate of the Ottoman Empire would rest, more often than anyone admitted, in my hands. My name, in the end, was Hatice Turhan Sultan. But I did not start with that name. I did not start with anything at all. This is my story, or as close to it as history has been able to reconstruct, because the truth about me was buried under centuries of rumor, rivalry, and the convenient silences that great empires prefer to keep about the women who ran them. The girl who arrived with nothing. Historians still argue about where I came from. Some say Russia. Some say the wider Ruthenian lands, what today might be called Ukraine or Belarus. One account even whispers of Circassian blood. The truth is, none of us who arrived through the slave markets got to keep our own story. Our origins were rewritten the moment we crossed the threshold of the harem. I was taken, most likely around the year 1639, during one of the Crimean Nogai raids that regularly swept through the borderlands of Eastern Europe. The Crimean Khan's men did this work efficiently. Villages were stripped of anything valuable: grain, livestock, and children who might fetch a price in Istanbul. I was one of those children. I was carried south by a commander named Suleiman Pasha and delivered, not sold in some chaotic bazaar, as people often imagine, but presented as a formal gift to the most powerful woman in the empire at that time, Kösem Sultan, grandmother of the reigning line, and a woman who had already outlived and outmaneuvered nearly everyone who tried to challenge her. I did not know it then, but I had just been handed to the single most dangerous, most brilliant political mind in the entire Ottoman court. Kösem Sultan did not raise slave girls out of kindness. She raised them as investments. I was placed under the supervision of Hatice Sultan for my early education, and then Kösem Sultan herself took a direct hand in shaping me, not just in the etiquette of the harem, but in something far more valuable: the architecture of power. How to read a room of viziers, how to survive court intrigue, how one day to become Valide Sultan, the mother of a reigning sultan, the single most powerful title a woman could hold in that world.
Kösem Sultan was not preparing me to be loved. She was preparing me to be useful and being obeyed to her, and eventually dangerous. The Sultan who feared women. By the time I reached the age to be presented to the Sultan, the man who sat on the Ottoman throne was Ibrahim I. History remembers him today as Ibrahim the Mad, though I want to be honest with you about who he really was, because the nickname flattens a much sadder truth. Ibrahim had grown up trapped in what the Ottomans called the kafes, the cage, a suite of rooms where potential heirs to the throne were kept confined, sometimes for their entire lives, so they could never threaten a ruling sultan. Ibrahim watched as a boy while his own brothers were executed one by one to secure the throne for their siblings. He lived every day of his early life believing his own death warrant could arrive at any moment. By the time he was finally freed and crowned sultan in 1640, he was a deeply damaged man, terrified, among other things, of women. The empire had a problem. Ibrahim had no children, and an empire without an heir is an empire staring at collapse. Kösem Sultan tried everything to calm her son's fears and encourage him toward the harem. Nothing worked. Until I was presented to him.
I do not know exactly what happened in that room. No one alive recorded it in a way historians trust completely. What we do know is this: something shifted. Ibrahim's paralyzing fear eased, at least enough. And on January 2nd, 1642, I gave birth to a son. They named him Mehmed. I was perhaps 15 years old. I had just secured the one thing that could never be taken away from me in that world: a male heir to the Ottoman throne. Whatever else happened to me from that day forward, I was now the mother of a prince. Possibly, one day, the mother of a sultan. I understood immediately what that meant. In the Ottoman court, giving birth to an heir wasn't the end of a woman's ambition. It was the beginning of it. A throne built on a strangling cord. Ibrahim's reign did not improve with time. If anything, his instability deepened. Stories spread, some true, some certainly exaggerated by rivals looking to justify what came next, about extravagant spending, about a treasury being emptied for furs and jewels, about a sultan who could no longer be trusted to hold the empire together. By 1648, the pressure had built to a breaking point. The Janissary Corps, the religious establishment, and Kösem Sultan herself agreed on one thing: Ibrahim had to go. On August 8th, 1648, they deposed him. Days later, he was strangled with a silk cord, the traditional, almost ritualized method of removing an Ottoman sultan without spilling royal blood directly. My son Mehmed, 7 years old, a child who likely barely understood what had happened to his father, was placed on the throne of the Ottoman Empire. And here is where my own story should have reached its triumphant turn. By every tradition of the Ottoman court, the mother of the reigning sultan became Valide Sultan, the undisputed head of the imperial harem, and very often, the true power behind a child ruler. That title should have been mine. It was not. Kösem Sultan, the same woman who had raised me, trained me, and placed me in Ibrahim's path,
decided she was not finished ruling. She argued, not without some logic, that I was too young, too inexperienced, too untested to hold the reins of an empire during such a fragile moment. She reinstated herself as regent, taking the title and the power that tradition said belonged to me.
I want you to sit with that for a moment. The woman who had shaped me from the age of 12, who had personally trained me for exactly this role, looked at the finished product of her own education and decided I was not yet allowed to use it. I was furious. And I was patient. Those two things, together, would define the next 3 years of my life. The war behind the lattice screen. What followed has been called, by later historians, one of the fiercest and most consequential power struggles in Ottoman history, and it was fought almost entirely by women, from behind screens and closed doors, using a currency far more dangerous than swords: loyalty, information, and patience. Kösem Sultan held the support of the Janissary Corps, the empire's elite military class, who had backed her for decades. I did not have an army. What I had was something quieter, and in the long run, more useful. The loyalty of the chief black eunuch of my household, a man named Lala Suleiman Aga, and crucially, the support of the Grand Vizier. For 3 years, this was the true government of the Ottoman Empire. Not the boy sultan sitting on the throne, but 2 women, one his grandmother, one his mother, locked in a silent war for control of his regency. I will not pretend, all these centuries later, that my hands were entirely clean in what happened next. On September 2nd, 1651, Kösem Sultan was killed inside the palace, strangled, according to most accounts, by agents loyal to my faction, in the dead of night. Historians still debate exactly how much I orchestrated and how much simply happened around me, in my favor, by men eager to see me win. What is not in dispute is this: after that night, there was no one left standing between me and the regency of the Ottoman Empire. I became Valide Sultan. My daily allowance rose to 3,000 akçe, a figure that, in the accounting of the Ottoman court, told everyone exactly how much power I now carried. I was perhaps 24 years old, and for the next 3 decades, in one form or another, I ran an empire. A woman learning to rule on the job. I want to be honest with you about something the old chronicles rarely admit plainly. I was not a natural statesman when I took power. I had been trained in the politics of the harem, in survival, in influence, in reading the currents beneath a room. I had not been trained in treasury management, military logistics, or the endless, grinding negotiations of an empire at war on multiple fronts. The Ottoman Empire I inherited control of was fighting a brutal, expensive naval war against Venice over the island of Crete, a conflict that would drag on unbelievably for 24 years in total. The treasury was strained, the janissaries were restless. Grand viziers came and went with dizzying speed, several of them executed for failing to solve problems that, frankly, no single vizier could have solved alone. I appointed one particularly capable man, Tarhunshu Ahmed Pasha, as Grand Vizier in 1652. He was the first to attempt something genuinely modern for the empire, preparing an actual fiscal year budget in advance, cutting unnecessary court expenditures, trying to bring discipline to a treasury that had been bleeding for years. For his efforts,
he was executed in 1653. A reminder that in the Ottoman court, even competence could be a fatal liability if it threatened the wrong interests.
I headed the imperial council in matters that mattered most. I controlled treasury decisions. I signed documents, appointed and dismissed statesmen, and yes, I made decisions about the Cretan campaign that affected the lives of thousands of soldiers I would never meet. But I also learned, gradually, one of the hardest lessons of power. Knowing when to delegate is not the same as losing control. In 1656, with the empire arguably closer to genuine crisis than at any point in my regency, I made what historians now consider the single most important decision of my political life. I appointed an elderly, ruthlessly capable Albanian statesman named Sultan Mehmed Pasha as Grand Vizier, but only after extracting from him an extraordinary condition. He demanded, and I granted him, near total authority to govern without palace interference, and immunity from the kind of intrigue that had gotten his predecessors killed. It was, in some ways, the moment I chose the empire's stability over my own direct control of it. Köprülü went on to found a dynasty of grand viziers that would steady the Ottoman state for decades after my own death. I do not think history gives me enough credit for that decision. I saw a man who could do the job better than the parade of executed viziers before him, and I stepped back enough to let him do it.
The mosque I built for myself. If you visit Istanbul today and stand near the Golden Horn, close to the Galata Bridge, you will see a mosque with 2 towering minarets and a dome that catches the light off the water. It is called, simply, the Yeni Jami, the new mosque. Most visitors walking past it have no idea it carries my fingerprints. The site had a strange, unlucky history before I touched it. An earlier Valide Sultan, Safiye Sultan, had begun construction there decades before I was even born, but the project was abandoned when her son died and her political power collapsed. The half-finished site sat neglected for years, then was further damaged by a catastrophic fire that swept through Istanbul in 1660. In the aftermath of that fire, the imperial architect approached me with a proposal. Finish what Safiye had started. I said yes, and I did not do it quietly. I completed the mosque complex and expanded it, adding a school, public fountains, and crucially, a marketplace that would become one of the most famous in the world, the Egyptian Spice Bazaar, financed by revenues from Ottoman Egypt, which still operates today as one of the largest covered markets in Istanbul. The mosque officially opened for prayer in 1665. It was, and remains, the first imperial mosque in Ottoman history commissioned and completed by a woman. Not commissioned by a sultan and merely funded by a woman behind the scenes. Mine, from foundation to minaret, built in my name. I did not build it purely out of piety, though my faith mattered to me. I built it because I understood something that women in power have understood across every era of history. Influence that isn't made visible in stone and marble tends to be forgotten the moment you're gone. I was not going to let that happen to me. I also turned my attention to matters far less decorative. The Dardanelles, the narrow strait guarding the sea approach to Istanbul itself, had become a point of dangerous vulnerability during the long war with Venice. I ordered the construction of 2 new fortresses along its shores to strengthen our defenses, a project that had nothing to do with piety
and everything to do with the cold calculation of holding an empire together.
The long twilight. As my son Mehmed grew into adulthood, my direct political grip loosened, as it should have. A Valide Sultan's regency is, by its nature, a temporary arrangement, a bridge between a child's accession and his own capacity to rule. I had spent over 3 decades in one form or another as the most powerful woman, and at times, arguably the most powerful person in the Ottoman Empire. But no regency lasts forever, and mine did not either.
I spent my final years in Edirne, the old Ottoman capital that had become something of a second court under my son's reign. I died there on August 4th, 1683, though a few sources record the date slightly differently, either in late April or in early July of that same year. Even the precise details of my death, like so much of my early life, were never recorded with the certainty history usually reserves for sultans.
They brought my body back to Istanbul and buried me in the mausoleum I had built as part of my own mosque complex, the Yeni Jami I had fought to complete. It was, in its own way, a fitting resting place. 6 future Ottoman sultans would eventually be buried in that same mausoleum beside me. Mehmed IV, my own son, along with Mustafa II, Osman III, Ahmed III, Mahmud I, and Murad V. Historians would later mark my death as the symbolic end of an era they now call the Sultanate of Women, a period stretching back more than a century to Kösem Sultan, the legendary consort of Suleiman the Magnificent, who first showed the empire that a woman from the harem could shape the fate of a nation. I was, in the end, the last of that line to hold that kind of unchecked power. I have thought often, across the centuries this story has been retold, about what people choose to remember and what they choose to forget. They remember Kösem Sultan's murder more than they remember Tarhunshu Ahmed Pasha's budget reforms. They remember rumors of my ambition more than they remember the 20 years of relatively stable governance that followed my appointment of Köprülü Mehmed Pasha. They remember sometimes that I built a beautiful mosque and forget entirely that I also fortified a strait against naval invasion, because fortresses are less romantic than domes and minarets. I was 12 years old when I lost everything I had ever known. I was 15 when I gave birth to the child who would make me powerful. I was perhaps 24 when I finally claimed the title that should have been mine 3 years earlier. And I spent the better part of 30 years afterward learning, sometimes through devastating mistakes, how to actually wield the power I had fought so hard to take. I do not ask you to admire everything I did. Power, especially power seized the way mine was, rarely comes with clean hands. But I do ask you to remember this. I was not a footnote in someone else's history. I was not simply the mother of a sultan, waiting quietly behind a screen for permission to matter. For over 3 decades, an empire that stretched across 3 continents answered, in ways both visible and invisible, to a girl who arrived in Istanbul with absolutely nothing. That girl became Hatice Turhan Sultan, and her mosque still stands on the edge of the Golden Horn, watching the ships come in, exactly as she intended it to. So, that was the story of Hatice Turhan Sultan, a girl who arrived with nothing and left behind a mosque
that still stands on the Istanbul skyline today. If you enjoyed this journey into history, hit subscribe for more true stories from the past, told the way they deserve to be told. And let me know in the comments who you'd like to hear from next. Thank you for listening.